Mr. Shri Jaipuria ji, Dr. S.K. Mahapatra ji, Mr. Vinod Malhotra ji, members of the faculty, students, distinguished guests. I am grateful to Mr. Shri Jaipuria and Dr. Mahapatra for the privilege they have extended to me to address the 7th Convocation. The Jaipuria family's history of philanthropy, especially in the field of education, is legendary. For 112 years, they have inspired, guided, and sustained a set of remarkable educational institutions in different parts of India. I salute Mr. Shri Jaipuria for carrying forward his family's noble tradition. I am tempted to describe this impressive campus as a monument to the Jaipurias, but no, the real monument consists of young men and women who are filling this hall. You, my young friends, are the living proof of the vision of the Jaipurias. To those who have received their degrees today, I offer my warmest felicitations. The outside world is waiting with open arms to greet you with contracts and offers, and I believe some of them have already been made. But you will remember, as you've been taught by your professors in the JSB, that earning money is not the goal of life, even though there is nothing inherently wrong in doing so. Your real goal is to be the leaders of change in society, to build a new India and to make our country better and stronger. It is customary in ceremonies like this for chief guests at a convocation to indulge in a long lecture on values to remind you of the good old days and offer you much advice on how to meet the challenges of life. I will spare you that torture. You are among the smartest young people in this country, and your professors have given you enough guidance to see you through the problems in your life. Every new generation in India, and I would say in the rest of the world, is turning out to be smarter than the earlier generation. My 6-year-old grandson knows far more about computers than I can ever understand. So I will dispense with the advice and instead share some thoughts with you on the world we live in, on the present, and especially on the foreign policy of our country. I have spent 41 years in the diplomatic service. For many of you, I'm sure, I may appear to be from a different planet. After all, what can be common between the world of management and the world of diplomacy? Diplomats deal with foreign policy, with issues of war and peace, and many other problems. Your world is dominated by business and enterprise, with manufacturing, services, banking, taxation, and the like. Diplomats deal with démarches, communiques, protocol, notes verbal. You will be dealing with balance sheets, DPRs, MOUs, startups, venture capital, and the like. But actually, if you set aside the jargon, diplomacy and management are actually quite similar, and they have a lot in common. You are all trained to be managers, manager of trading, manufacturing, services, and capital. Diplomats are also managers, but of a different kind. They manage embassies and passport offices. They manage government-to-government relations. They manage economic and commercial exchanges and defense issues. In crisis situations, they look after the welfare of Indian citizens abroad and often rescue them from situations of conflict, terrorism, and natural disasters. The skills required are the same as yours: optimizing human resources, using good communications, employing common sense, and identifying adversaries and being tough in negotiations. Just as scientists like geologists and geophysicists study the physical features of the world, diplomats observe the changing features of geopolitical relations. Scientists report on structural changes which lead to earthquakes, tsunamis, droughts, and floods. Diplomats study the rise and fall of world powers. They try to avoid conflict and promote peace. Tectonic changes periodically take place both in the physical and the diplomatic world. In recent diplomatic history, tectonic changes have taken place in the world during the First and the Second World War, during the Cold War period, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let us now turn our focus to India's foreign policy. It was left to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru to formulate and shape the foreign policy of a newly independent India. He had before him two historical models, Kautilya in the 4th century BC and King Ashoka in the 3rd century BC. Kautilya projected pragmatism, realism, and the pursuit of power. Ashoka, who started as a disciple of Kautilya, converted to Buddhism after the Kalinga War and devoted his life to spirituality, compassion, and the pursuit of peace. Pandit Nehru opted for the Ashokan model because Kautilya represented for him the foreign and strategic policies of the British Raj. Under Pandit Nehru, India did not seek power. It promoted peace. It refused to join the power blocs. India championed the cause of the colonized nations, opposed apartheid in South Africa, and often mediated between the US and the Soviet Union. India was the peacemaker after the Korean War ended in 1952. In 1954, it helped in the transition to freedom of the Indochina states and then went on to become a founding member of the non-reliant movement. The Nehruvian model prevailed during much of the Cold War period. There was continuity in foreign policy, which was carried forward under the leadership of Indira Gandhi, of Rajiv Gandhi, and Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, as I mentioned earlier, brought about a tectonic change in international affairs, and India was affected by it, as the rest of the world. It led to another phenomenon in the shift of the center of gravity of geopolitics from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. And with that, there has been the emergence of new powers in the world, with China, India, South Africa, Brazil, and countries like that. And expanding China has started challenging the hegemony of the United States. To meet the threat of an aggressive China, many countries in the region have moved closer to the US, including India. As of now, there is a convergence between the rebalance in Asia of President Obama and the Look East, Act East policy of Prime Minister Modi. Let me go back to the developments after the end of the Cold War. It was against the changes brought about after the end of the Cold War that Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee carried out the first major overhauling of India's foreign policy after Nehru. I can speak with some confidence about this period because it was under Mr. Vajpayee that I was appointed High Commissioner in London, Foreign Secretary in India, and Ambassador in Washington. Mr. Vajpayee made 5 major departures from the earlier foreign policy of the Nehruvian period. 1, there was a shift from idealism to realism. 2, foreign policy became a composite exercise which also became important stakeholders in foreign policy. Number 3, the concept of security was expanded from just the protection of India's borders to the protection of India's vital interests throughout the world. Number 4, the countries of our neighborhood were given much greater importance than in the past. And number 5, non-alignment was virtually abandoned. And instead, a policy was followed, which I will call co-alignment. We selected a bunch of countries, numbering about 25 or so, which were important for India's security and economic interests, and we called them strategic partners. Now, I must clarify here that I'm not speaking of official policy, because officially, non-alignment is still the basis of our foreign policy. And I got into trouble in a gathering like this when I said non-alignment was dead. And this was unfortunately reported in the papers from the Islamic Republic of Iran, which demanded that the MEA must clarify whether non-alignment was dead or alive. And the official clarification was, it remains very much a part of our policy. Nevertheless, I maintain that non-alignment is accepted and retained as a mantra rather than an active policy which we follow. This was broadly the foreign policy initiatives launched by Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee and continued by his successors, Dr. Manmohan Singh and Mr. Narendra Modi. A question which is frequently asked to me is, what is new in Mr. Modi's foreign policy? In fact, this was the topic which I was asked to speak on at the Ahmedabad Management Association about a year ago. And addressing the Gujarati elite in their own stronghold, I knew that I had to be, let me put it this way, diplomatic. What is new in Mr. Modi's foreign policy? I asked, and I replied, nothing. So there was an awkward pause, and I thought that the full-blooded Gujaratis in the audience will start throwing things at me. But they were a decent audience, and after the awkward pause, I completed my sentence, and I said, there was nothing new in Mr. Modi's foreign policy, but there are plenty of new initiatives that Mr. Modi has introduced into distinction between foreign policy and diplomacy. Foreign policy is a framework of objectives and principles. Diplomacy is the method by which diplomacy is more about tactics. Of course, this is a simplification. But the best way to understand is, if you're building a house, the architect does the framework and the engineers and contractors build the building. So the policy is framed by the government. The diplomats carry out the government's policies. I hope that distinction is clear. It is true that Mr. Modi has followed the policy he inherited from Mr. Vajpayee and Dr. Manmohan Singh. But his diplomacy has been quite remarkable and, in my view, has many distinct qualities. Let me clarify here that I have not taken part in the Modi government, and my views are entirely personal. I clarify that I am neither a follower nor opponent of Mr. Modi. I am just a professional practitioner who is giving you an objective analysis of foreign policy as I see it. And if there is praise or this criticism, that is entirely professional. As I mentioned, there are distinct features. There are about 3 distinct features in Mr. Modi's diplomacy. It has, first of all, a Modi brand, a Modi style, and a Modi method of communication. Mr. Modi is the effective Foreign Minister of India and its #1 diplomat, even though he has a full-time External Affairs Minister, a National Security Advisor, and a Foreign Secretary. Mr. Modi's diplomacy is marked by abundant energy and stamina. You may remember that he was on a Navaratra fast when he went on his first state visit to Washington. And he went through 10 grueling days. He works harder than any minister or civil servant of the government. As he once said, "Main na sota hoon, na sone deta hoon." There is also this Modi style, and I'm not referring only to his half-sleeve kurtas and his colorful jackets. When Mr. Modi meets his counterparts, he establishes an instant chemistry with them. And this is indeed very good diplomacy. Like what he did with Barack Obama or Shinzo Abe or Xi Jinping. It was a conversation between Barack and Narendra from the time they met in Washington. And then there is the Modi system of mass communication, which he has demonstrated in his meetings with massive gatherings of the diaspora abroad, especially in New York, London, Moscow, Abu Dhabi, and Riyadh. A second innovation of Mr. Modi is that he does not depend entirely on the government machinery. Mr. Modi receives inputs from various sources, from his party machinery and from large groups of non-resident Indians abroad, particularly the tech-savvy young professionals. And finally, Mr. Modi has brought remarkable clarity in the formulation of foreign policy. In my view, he has selected three primary objectives of foreign policy. I would describe them as prosperity or samruddhi, security or suraksha, and status or swabhiman. Mr. Modi has identified samruddhi as the supreme goal of domestic and foreign policy. It is only through inclusive economic growth that India can eliminate poverty, and India can aspire to become a global power. As for suraksha, he recognizes that the threats against India are multiplying, and India is vulnerable because previous governments had neglected the defense sector. As for Swabhiman, you have to refer to the first line of the chapter on foreign policy in the BJP election manifesto. It declared that, and I quote, "A resurgent India must find its rightful place amongst the community of nations." A resurgent India must find its rightful place in the community of nations. It is in this pursuit of Swabhiman that every effort must be made, according to Mr. Modi, for India to occupy all the high tables of the world, whether it is the UN Security Council or the Nuclear Suppliers Group. India is already a member of the other high tables, the G20, the East Asia Summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, and more recently, the Missile Technology Control Regime. India, according to Mr. Modi, has to be projected as a civilizational power which has been the Vishwa Guru over the centuries. The world is beginning to recognize India's formidable soft power in the shape of yoga, Ayurveda, fashion, cuisine, films, and many other areas. Having established Samruddhi, Suraksha, and Swabhiman as his priorities, Mr. Modi has visited nearly 50 countries during the first 2 years in office, spreading India's message far and wide to the different corners of the world. So I would like to wind up with a quick evaluation of Mr. Modi's achievements in foreign policy as opposed to diplomacy. Since foreign policy covers a very wide area, I propose to talk about the three principal challenges of foreign policy today, which is dealing with the United States, China, and Pakistan. Let's come to the United States. The pride of place in Mr. Modi's foreign policy goes to one special country, and that is the United States. I was privileged to be a part of the historic transformation of our relations with the United States, from an adversary of India to becoming a strategic partner. President Bill Clinton's visit to India in the year 2000 was a US presidential visit after a gap of 22 years. And it was under Clinton's successor, President George W. Bush, that India and the US became strategic partners. In 2014, when Mr. Modi became Prime Minister, Indo-US relations were actually at a very low ebb. There were substantial differences between the two countries over intellectual property rights, over the lack of progress in India's economic reforms, the government's tax policy, often described as tax terrorism, and the paralysis in government decision-making. A minor incident involving a junior diplomat, Ms. Devyani Khobragare, brought Indo-US relations to its lowest point since 1998. Within a year in office, Mr. Modi had dramatically energized the relationship and raised it to a new height. He has had 6 meetings with President Obama, and 3 of these were exclusively bilateral summits. The results have been impressive. Indo-US trade has tripled from $36 billion in 2005 to $107 billion in 2015. And the goal is to raise it to $500 billion by 2025. There are over 500 American companies working in India and working actively. The number of Indian companies in the US has increased from 85 in 2005 to over 200 today. India has been designated a major defense partner of the US, under which it is entitled to receive the same high technology that its closest US allies can receive. The list of Indo-US successes is too large for me to continue. To sum up, I would say that a close partnership with the US is Mr. Modi's most impressive diplomatic achievement. Let me come to China. Our relations with China are a complete contrast with what we have with the United States. It is not that Mr. Modi has not tried or invested in improving ties with China. He has held 2 summit meetings with the Chinese President, Mr. Xi Jinping. And many meetings do take place. Yet, despite Mr. Modi's efforts, serious differences remain between India and China. Differences remain over the 4,000 kilometers of disputed border, over the Chinese claims to Indian territory, including the whole province of Arunachal Pradesh, which it calls Southern Tibet. China's military nuclear support to Pakistan, which is posing a threat to India. China's blocking of India's membership of the UN Security Council and the Nuclear Suppliers Group. China obstructing the naming of Maulana Masood Azhar as a terrorist by the UN Security Council. They have done it again recently, and the matter has been postponed for another 3 months. China has been challenging India in the Indian Ocean area and has constructed a string of naval facilities in our neighborhood, in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka. They are negotiating something with the Maldives, and of course in Pakistan. And more recently, China has announced that it is going to build dams on the Brahmaputra, which will divert waters away from India and Bangladesh. No, our relations with China are not in good shape. While Mr. Modi has recently taken a firm stand with China, many believe he is not strong enough. Mr. Modi will meet President Xi Jinping within 9 days in Goa at the BRICS summit. And hopefully, he will convey a stronger message to China. Let me now come to Pakistan. Pakistan was considered by many of us in the strategic community as another case of weakness in Mr. Modi's foreign policy. His approach to Pakistan seemed to swing between the extremes of friendship and hostility. But this is no longer the case after India's bold response to the terrorist attack in Uri. The period of strategic restraint, of feeling helpless and impotent in responding to Pakistan's acts of terrorism, is now over. A bold diplomatic offensive to isolate Pakistan internationally and also within SAARC, combined with surgical strikes on terrorist launch pads across the line of control, these have constituted a masterstroke of diplomacy. I would say this has been Mr. Modi's finest hour. Mr. Modi has proved himself to be a worthy disciple of that very celebrated but much neglected strategic guru, Kautilya. Just as Kautilya had prescribed, Mr. Modi applied to Pakistan the 4 most potent instruments of diplomacy: Sama, which is friendship, Dana, which is generosity, Bheda, which is isolation, and finally Danda, which is punishment. So Sama, Dana, Bheda, Danda is what Kautilya had said in the 4th century BC as instruments of diplomacy against a difficult neighbor. And Mr. Modi has actually practiced it. Speaking of Kautilya, he is wrongly portrayed often as an immoral warmonger. Nothing could be further from the truth. For Kautilya, the principal goal of government was the welfare of the citizens. And the method of this welfare was through the creation of wealth. Vanijye vasate Lakshmi is what Kautilya said, which means that the way to wealth is through commercial activity. He said, Vanijye vasate Lakshmi, tad ardham krishi karmani, tad ardham rajya sevayam, vikshayam naiva nevata. I think Vanijye vasate Lakshmi could well be the motto of the Jaipuria School of Business, that wealth is created through commercial activity. India is shaping itself as a new nation before our eyes. By a lot of things that are happening, as the chairman and the director have said, by 2030, according to projections, China will be the world's #1 economy with a GDP of $35 trillion. The US will be #2 with $33 trillion. And India will be #3 with $10 trillion. And this is by 2030. By 2030, India will hopefully have become a Swachh Bharat, a skilled India, an India with smart cities and bullet train. India by then will be a strong nation and a leading global power. That, my young friends, is going to be your India. Let me therefore conclude by offering you my best wishes and my hope that you will be worthy citizens of this new India. Thank you for your patience.
Chairman, Jaipuria Group, Mr. Shri Jaipuria, to felicitate our chief guest, Mr. Lalit Mansingh, with the memento.